Hello, my world history students, and welcome to this first part in a four-part series dealing with World War I and its end. These are notes 12.2a, and this is, of course, Mr. Marks. I'll give you a few moments to write down, you can pause if you want, the key points for these presentations. Please make sure that your notes include all of these. World War I was a new kind of war. It would bring about a new phrase called total war. Total war is when an entire country is immersed in the war effort. Germany's going to raise its taxes and borrow huge amounts of money from its citizens to pay for the cost of the war. The nations will have to ration food and other products, from boots to gasoline to canned food products. In addition, they'll put up other economic controls, such as setting prices so that inflation won't affect their countries too much, and forbidding strikes. This will happen in pretty much all of the countries. The entire country will be forced to be a part of the war effort. Factories which had built cars are now going to be turned into building guns and ammunition. Commercial airplane builders will be building warplanes. Everything's going to be turned around. What total war does is it means now that anybody is a fair target. It's the downside of turning your entire society into this war-building machine, is now generals would feel completely within their right to start targeting these factories which were filled with civilians, because it would stop the ammunition which would kill their own soldiers, the general soldiers. This changes war. Civilians had been targeted in the past, but nothing on quite this scale. Never had a society been quite pushed to this level of total warfare. One side effect of total warfare was the need for conscription. While people had been very enthused about the war in the beginning, we talked about the militarization of all these countries, not as many people were willing to volunteer for the war once the horrors of it really started coming out. People were dying by the millions. There was a stalemate. There wasn't much movement. And I apologize for the poor quality of this picture, but rallies would start to be held in order to stop the government from forcing people to fight. The conscription is when young men are drafted into the armed service, where members of a country can just be randomly selected and then forced to serve in the military. Obviously, for many reasons, people are quite a bit against this, and this was true even during World War I, a time when you would think that enthusiasm for the glory of war was still at a high point. And countries try to combat this. One of the main ways they did was through propaganda. Propaganda is any time that somebody is trying to convince somebody else that what they're saying is true. It's usually used through misdirection. It's used through applying to people's emotions or their fears. These are just a couple of examples of propaganda used at the time. You can see the one on the left, and again, I apologize for the pixelization on these, but the caption reads, the little girl's asking the father, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" And you can't quite see it, but he's kind of looking towards whoever's taking the picture with a look of, oh, what do I tell my kids? This is focusing on the guilt. What would you say when people asked, hey, what did you do during that Great War? The one on the right is an example of negative propaganda. You notice that the pig which the American soldier is holding has a German helmet and has a brand with the German symbol on it. Just a way of showing that the other side was less than human was a very common part of propaganda. Propaganda its whole purpose is to arouse people's suspicions, their ill feelings towards the other side. Most of what propaganda says is actually untrue. I mean, these are some bland examples. War crimes, tales of Germans going in and raping the women that had been left behind in villages and slaughtering children were usually untrue stories. These stories of atrocities were used to help stir the emotions from the citizens. And everybody was guilty of it. All of the sides used propaganda in order to try to further their cause. Women played a critical role, especially in this new total war idea. As millions of men were left to fight, women would have to take over these men's jobs and keep the national economies going. Many women now worked in war industries, manufacturing weapons and building supplies. Others would join women's branches of the armed forces. When food shortages threatened Britain, volunteers in the Women's Land Army went to the fields to grow the food for the nation. In most cases, still women were not allowed to be on the front lines. Those women who were on the front lines weren't soldiers, but many of them were nurses. It was actually a relatively new profession which was being spread around at the time. And these nurses shared the dangers of the men who had been injured. Their aid stations were close to the front lines. These nurses worked around the clock, especially after floods of casualties would come in when some commander decided to tell his troops to rush across no man's land in what was known as a big push. One English nurse, Vera Britton, will talk about dealing with 90-degree days in France, where she has to, and these are in her words, she's spending her time stopping hemorrhages, replacing intestines, and draining and reinserting innumerable rubber tubes with gruesome human remains heaped on the floor. These were women who saw the true horrors of war. These nurses would become even more valuable as one greater tragedy, as bad as the war was, started to sweep the world. That is a pandemic. A pandemic is an epidemic that can spread through an entire continent, or in this case, around the world. We're afraid of pandemics like the swine flu or avian flu affecting us today, and this right here is one of the main reasons why. The flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 hit the world hard. It killed 20 to 40 million people. The numbers aren't sure because we had to use mass graves. It has been cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded world history. More people died in a single year from this influenza than in the 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351 that we've talked about before. This is often known as the Spanish flu, unfairly, but that it seemed to have originated from Spain. And it was a global disaster. The picture that you see there is an emergency hospital set up for influenza patients in order to quarantine them from the rest of society. One other thing before we get into the next part of this presentation, which we'll talk more about the war itself, was Great Britain had found a way to start staving off the U-boat attacks. If you remember, the U-boats had been used by the Germans in order to cut Britain off from its supplies. And the British came up with a strategy to kind of survive this. They used convoys, large groups of ships together in order to have outlying ships report when they spotted a submarine coming, and then they'd be able to use depth charges in order to blow the U-boat out of the water. This was this became a very effective tactic that would reduce Germany's ability to really hold Britain back. And this is going to lead to Germany doing more unrestricted submarine attacks, and that will lead to serious consequence for Germany, as it will force the U.S. into the war, as I'll talk about on a later part of this presentation. So, just for some quick review, how had people's attitudes towards war changed? And definitely think about the reactions towards conscription for this. What roles did women play in the war? What pandemic swept the world during World War I? And how did the British counteract the effectiveness of the German U-boat attacks?